Thank you, Kelsey. Good afternoon, everyone. We are in the committee of the whole meeting of September 11th. Haakon Fall and Peace Lefma, Class Squamish, Oweamel. Welcome to the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. There is an agenda in front of the committee. For motion to adopt the agenda, moved by Councillor Elliott, seconded by Councillor Race. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? Motion carries. We have one item on the open agenda, which is the Squamish 2040 OCP management and phasing options, and I will pass it over to Matt and Sarah.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Good afternoon. My name is Matt Gunn. I'm a planner with the District of Squamish.
Sarah McJanet, planner.
And as pointed out, we are talking about growth management today. Just give a quick overview about the presentation I'm going to give. We'll talk a little bit about the background, what's gotten us to this point. I'll talk briefly about the growth management tools that are available to us to use in the official community plan. Talk briefly about some of the options that have been considered by council and by the community previously. And then we're trying to leave the bulk of the time for our meeting here to discuss growth management policy, for council to have that discussion. And staff's goal, what we would love to have out of this meeting, is to receive council direction on an appropriate growth management strategy to be presented to the public through the legislative OCP process. And then one last thing, we'd like to leave some time at the end of the meeting to discuss in specific district lot 509, 510. Mr. Chima, who is the owner of this parcel, is here and has provided letters relevant to growth management, which are attached to the agenda. However, I think it would be good to leave this to the end of the meeting and to focus our discussion more generally on growth management and the OCP policy if possible. So if we could leave some time at the end, that would be fantastic. So background, where are we at? We're currently in phase 3 of the official community plan. We're trying to finalize the plan so that council can consider it for first and second reading by the end of the year. And that's part of what we're doing right now, trying to finalize the growth management piece. A key focus of the phase 3 public engagement was to solicit community input on growth management options, and that was done using a policy guide and a questionnaire on the topic. I want to turn our attention to the growth management tools that are up for discussion. But before we do that, I just want to highlight kind of at a big picture level what's available to us to use. With the growth management, there are kind of two pieces. There's the where and the when of development, and that's really what we want to talk about today. These are the kind of the policy options that we're trying to use to target this piece. Designated growth areas, urban containment boundary, land use designations, population thresholds. This is kind of what we're trying to talk about right now, where and when we do growth. There's another piece of growth management, which is the how, things like fiscal, health impacts, employment linkages, transportation. This is more the how development occurs, and much of this is addressed through sub-area planning. And so this is a piece that we don't need to discuss as much, I think, today. That's not the focus of our questions today. Really, we're trying to do more the where and the when. So, tools. First tool I want to talk about is land use designations, and specifically the future residential neighborhoods land use designation. So this is a fairly significant clarification that's been added to the official community plan. It's a clear indication that the parcels that are designated for future residential neighborhood are not intended to be developed until significant development and build out of existing residential lands has occurred. The lands designated future residential neighborhood are the ones that are colored peach in the image on the screen there. With the future residential neighborhood lands, it's possible to specify conditions that must be met prior to development of these lands. And a few of the different options that are available, which are up for consideration, are population thresholds and completion of policy precursors. These are things that we've discussed and we can discuss more today. And then another piece is absorption of a defined percentage of estimated infill capacity, existing infill capacity. This has kind of been referenced as substantially built out in previous discussions. And council has asked us to talk about how that might be defined. And so staff has considered this and come up with a proposal, and that is that it would be defined as 85% of all vacant, underutilized available lands in existing areas be developed based on density targets established through sub-area planning prior to moving forward for future residential neighborhood lands in the context of talking about absorption. So that's a piece to consider. Another tool is population thresholds. we do use population thresholds in our OCP at present. The current policy is there on the screen. Expansion into District Block 509, 510, and 513 will only be considered for future sub-area plans once the district's population reaches 22,500. The intent of this is to balance the need for growth with the associated infrastructure costs over time. And staff's proposed that a population threshold be expanded to all future residential neighborhood designated lands in the OCP. And I want to talk a little bit about how that threshold expansion is being considered by staff. Right now, our current threshold of 22,500 at a sustained growth rate of 2 to 3% could be reached in about 5 to 6 years. And we've got significant infill capacity beyond the 22,500. So what we've proposed is that we increase the population threshold to 34,000, which is the sum of the current population and the anticipated infill capacity at the low end of our projection for infill capacity. So that would bring it up to 34,000. And again, the intent of that policy is to maximize our current infrastructure and focus growth on infill areas. Another policy tool for growth management that has been discussed actually at the last meeting we had with council on growth management. There was a topic of conversation around policy precursors to development in future residential neighborhoods. And the suggestion was that to proactively address policy gaps that would inform council on decisions regarding these lands, there were policy items that needed to be completed. And the items that were highlighted are important policy pieces, and many of them are being addressed either through the OCP or current standalone policy projects. So critical trail network was one of the ones mentioned. That's currently under development for inclusion in the OCP with a variety of trail stakeholders. There's discussion around a missing middle housing policy piece, and we're developing policy to be included in the OCP regarding missing middle, and as well we'll include a direction to amend the zoning bylaw as appropriate based on that. And then there was a piece mentioned around community amenity contributions and affordable housing targets, and those are under development through separate standalone policy, which would be a companion to the OCP or would complement the OCP. So further development of these, further development will be assessed against these policy pieces and ideally in alignment with them based on council decision making. Another tool to be discussed is urban containment boundary. The urban containment boundary is intended as the ultimate boundary between urban and non-urban areas within the foreseeable future. It's intended to identify areas beyond which would be closed to most forms of development and remain unserviced. And so given this distinction, lands outside the urban containment boundary should only be designated as the non-urban designations which are there on the screen: conservation resource, parks, restricted industrial facilities. Council previously asked staff to consider reducing the area included in the urban containment boundary. That was a topic of discussion at our last meeting on this matter. And so we've taken a look at some of the opportunities to tighten up the urban containment boundary. So on the parcels that we're looking at that would be appropriate for this are parcels that are on the margin or the outside of or just on the inside of the urban containment boundary and are designated with those non-urban land uses. So at the south end of town, there's 3 in purple there that are non-urban land use designations on the margin. And at the north end, this was specifically talked about. The Chikai area is one of the areas that might be suitable for bringing in the urban containment boundary. And so we've got in purple, on the left is the existing urban containment boundary, on the right is areas that could be excluded based on their land use designation. The purple and the orange areas are combined, are all areas that currently have land use designations that are not within the urban context, and so it would be possible to bring the urban containment boundary to the south end of both the purple and orange. However, the area that's designated orange is part of the application that's in front of council right now regarding the Chikai development associated with the barrier mitigation, and it may make more sense to leave the urban containment boundary on the exterior of that parcel, given that it's currently up for consideration for development.
And just to clarify, when we say urban containment, we're talking about residential containment as opposed to other uses?
The
Whether it's
intention,
resource or industry or something else?
yeah, the intention of the urban containment boundary was to be the boundary between urban and non-urban, and servicing being a significant piece of that. So the idea that beyond that urban containment boundary, we wouldn't envision serviced urban development in any foreseeable future. Although there are, of course, the opportunity for extension of the urban containment boundary through OCP review or a process, a public participation process or engagement process.
Yeah, so just on this note, then, urban containment boundary, would that have agricultural in it? Is this to keep the urban out or to keep the urban in?
The boundary is intended to keep the urban in. So things within the boundary would be serviced areas, urban development. Agriculture could be appropriate for outside the boundary, although we can have agriculture within as well.
Can you just back up one slide, please?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Jason Manta.
So I have two questions. So on this slide, the big chunk that's sort of the south end of Valley Cliff, what's the designation there right now?
I would have to look it up, but I could do that.
Like, is it that purple?
Yeah, so
Yeah, those are, that area is designated for greenway corridors and recreation.
Okay.
It's a lot of environmentally sensitive content. And further, the parcel, sort of the teardrop shaped parcel, the lowest parcel is part of the Stormis Provincial Park now. So that was land that was converted to Provincial Park a few years ago.
Okay. And then on the second slide,
Yes.
so I'm wondering, because trying to picture all the boundaries here, does it include the airport, the urban containment boundary, the proposed?
The airport
Or is it
would,
going to exclude that?
the airport right now would be in the purple. So in the current urban containment boundary, of course, the airport is within that. In the proposed exclusion in purple, the airport would be within that at this point.
And so, going on that, if we were to retrench the urban containment boundary, what are the implications for an airport type of use? Does that exclude that kind of use? And I mean, we know specifically that the desire is for the airport to have some sort of long-term tenure and all of that. Would it preclude that if we were to change the urban containment boundary?
Yeah, this proposal here would be signaling that there isn't an intention to put servicing to that area at this point. Now, one of the reasons that it might be, and that may not be the vision for the airport in the long term, however, part of the issue with servicing in the airport is, I would imagine, related to the risk, correct, of that you get banned. So if that hazard was mitigated, then the OCP currently has policy that says at that point, it would initiate a sub-area plan to see how to deal with that whole area, and as part of that, the urban containment boundary could be reestablished to reflect the new context.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, specifically on the airport, because we could see that actually, with the retrenchment of the urban containment boundary, that actually makes it even more suitable for an airport type of use in that area, provided that we have an exclusion there that says, okay, well, we'll draw the boundary around the airport and say, you know, for airport use. So I'm hoping that maybe we can flag that a little bit.
Sure.
Because it does make sense that typically you want an airport use in a non-urbanized environment as much as possible. So just to take a look at what options there might be, recognizing that there is a fully operational airport there. So.
Yeah.
Doug?
Thank you. And just on that point, I mean, I generally agree with the containment boundary concept, but I think we have to be careful with our definition, because I think things like an airport, for example, and businesses around it, might be appropriate for something that's outside that. There might be some industries appropriate for something outside that. there might even be some commercial applications that are appropriate. I think it certainly would be primarily, in my mind, primarily focused on residential, but not exclusively. There might be some forms of commercial. So I think the definition is probably one of the more important parts. And that leads me to this question about the infrastructure costs of going beyond the urban containment boundary. And it's sort of a common theme throughout the report and in this growth management discussion. But when I think about the costs of extending infrastructure, typically that's borne by developers as opposed to municipal government. I know there's an ongoing expense or operating cost, but there is presumably taxation revenue from this extended area that would at least cover that or offset it significantly. But am I missing something? Is there something else there? Or, because it's kind of the developer's nickel to extend these water lines, sewer lines, road lines, and so forth, the road networks, as opposed to our cost.
Yeah, no, I can respond to that. So we spent some time at the outset of this OCP process talking with operations and engineering about the cost of extending services into greenfield areas. And one of the themes came out of that was that you're right, the provision of the service, ensuring that whatever new development is connected into our servicing network is indeed part of the development process, and so that would be borne at that time. But the long-term costs of maintaining that service are the ones that the report is really trying to address, how to maintain lower long-term servicing costs. And one of the things that came up was the more density you have in an area, the more chance of supporting that infrastructure without it becoming a burden on the rest of the community. And so if there were really dense development that occurred on the periphery, then you're right, that would probably not only pay for the services to be installed, but also pay for the services on an ongoing basis. But in the interim, the concept that came out is the more development we have within our core area, the better we support the existing servicing infrastructure we have without extending and having to take care of that servicing infrastructure over the long haul. So it's an attempt to try and push growth towards our infill areas, support the infrastructure we have without taking on new long-term operation and maintenance costs.
Yeah, it's twofold. It's about affording what we have today and making sure we can do that. And until the province changes the tax structure so we can actually reflect single-family home costs at the edges of our periphery versus something else, we don't have a fair system of actually recouping the monies that pays for the service to build that.
So, and I take that point. I mean, it's kind of, I guess it's more or less what I thought. It's sort of the gap, if you like, in operating costs versus revenue until you get enough taxpayers at the end of the line to sort of.
Exactly.
So, the last point, if I might, was just with respect to those two maps. There was two sets of maps in the report, but I was wondering about other areas for urban containment, and I was thinking about, for example, the Highlands Alice Lake area, above Quest or beyond Quest, above and beyond Aliquip, and things like that. But they weren't in the report, in that part of the discussion.
Can you, what is your question on that? Are you thinking we should include?
Well, is there a map of that, for example?
A map of other places to tighten up?
Well, where the urban containment boundary might be, where the red line would go actually.
It misses, the maps as they're set out doesn't show the eastern edge of a good chunk of the district, so we don't know where that goes. So if you go to this one and you go
Yeah.
down to the next one,
Okay, so you're
there's a
saying.
whole chunk that's, we don't know where the everything.
Right, okay. I can answer that question. So, yeah, okay. Yeah, we can grab that in just 1 second. But so essentially the urban containment boundary, are you saying you're not familiar with in the OCP what the proposed urban containment boundary is, or just the proposed changes?
Well, I guess the first thing then.
Okay.
if it's-
I'll
I'm
pull
not
it.
familiar with it. And secondly, is it going to change or is it something we should discuss changing?
Right, okay. Yeah, no, okay, I understand. So I can right now go to our website, pull up the urban containment boundary. I had only, in the report, included the boundary where I did a look at all of the areas on the boundary where it looked like it was possible to bring in the urban containment boundary based on the discussion that had occurred at the last meeting. And so I only reflected the areas that looked like there was a difference between what had been proposed initially and what we could potentially exclude.
I think there's a whole conversation about urban containment we haven't even touched on.
Sure. Would you like me to pull up the boundary map?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just in the
Yeah.
meantime, I just want to make the point that the intent of the proposed language for the urban containment boundary was not to limit the uses that are out there, like the airport. It would very much fit within the limited industrial type of designation. So it wouldn't mean that, you know, the district is going to wean off the airport use in that area.
Yeah, and I'll just fill in the dead air well. That's me. For me, the urban containment it's partially about where we will or won't extend infrastructure to, but it's also partially about where we won't consider residential development, and that we really want to make sure that we have areas of land to grow industrial and other uses as well. So for me, the urban containment is really about containing the residential piece of it, but not minimizing opportunities for job growth or things like that.
Yeah, and maybe to respond to that, so we came up with you know, a definition and an application of the urban containment boundary, but certainly it is not the only possible use of this concept. And so, you know, if council has other direction, then, you know, we're all ears. Does this provide the kind of additional
Yes.
information?
Thank you.
Is this worth leaving
And-
up for discussion?
Yeah, I've always had a bit of a problem with, on the eastern fringe, we tend to go around big blocks of land. And for me, the urban containment boundary doesn't necessarily have to consider ownership of certain lands, that it should really consider where we fiscally want to manage our infrastructure and where we want to preserve lands for jobs or research or whatever. So for me, just indiscriminately going on the outside of big blocks doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Meaning, there might be.
Meaning all the area in yellow hash is going on the outside of one big lot. It just happens to be a really big lot. If it was 20 smaller lots, where would we intuitively put an urban containment boundary in terms of geography, in terms of where infrastructure is, in terms of where we want to keep resource versus not?
Certainly, if I might add, the conundrum is that at the outset, for these large tracts of land on the periphery that will be subject to future sub-area planning, it's not until future sub-area planning actually occurs that where detailed analysis happens, where there's a designation of developable versus non-developable lands. We know that in a lot of these outer areas, you know, as with even lands within the floodplain, there are lots of different attributes and characteristics and areas that are not suitable, so lands of steep slope or lands within riparian areas or sensitive areas. So we know that those blocks of land will not necessarily all be suitable for development. But the challenge right now at the outset is that until we go through the sub-area planning, it's difficult to, you know, highlight where those developable versus non-developable lands are, and by extension, like where we would want to see development and extension of servicing and where we would not. So for the OCP, we simply allowed for recognition of those future lands within the time frame of the plan and drew the urban containment boundary around the outside. That being said, you know, certainly some communities with their urban containment boundaries, they just consider the lands that are necessary to accommodate their growth needs within the next 5 years, and they leave those long-term lands alone. But for Squamish, knowing the many constraints that we have, especially within the flood plan, and because of consecutive OCPs that have sort of highlighted those long-term future lands, we maintained or stuck with that convention of continuing to show those long-term lands.
Yeah, and I understand the rationale, I just don't, it's equally irrational for me to just think about following the outside of one particular landowner's boundary versus saying it should be here.
Mhm.
So it seems equally random to just say, oh, we'll go outside one property owner's boundary.
Yep, part of it's,
That was a property that was made, it's X amount, 20 acres to 1,000 acres, whatever it is, so it doesn't- I see it equally irrational.
yeah, and I hear your point. I think partly it's a matter of a choice to come in further could get really complicated and more challenging, and so maybe this was the easier choice for a staff to make rather than go, okay, well, where do we cut through that?
Yeah, that makes more sense to me.
Yeah, that's probably the reality.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, particularly where there's potential road connections. And I understand that if you're going to bring in 20 acres in order to make a road connection with services to do loops, for example, you would bring in the whole parcel of land, and that's what I kind of think they did there.
That's part of the mix as well.
Yeah.
How have we defined the urban containment boundary in the draft OCP? Have we given it a timeframe?
Yeah, if I might just read a couple of sentences, the way it's been framed in the discussion draft. The urban containment boundary shown in Schedule C delineates existing settled serviced areas and those designated for well-planned urban, residential, commercial, and major employment growth to 2040, along with critical utilities and supporting services. Areas outside the urban containment boundary are designated and maintained for rural and/or important resource lands, valued for agricultural, forestry, and resources potential, and for environmental conservation, cultural, recreational, and open space values. That's how we initially tried to frame what was within and what was intended to be without or outside the urban containment boundary. So we weren't necessarily considering only residential. By development, we took quite a broad definition of development to mean residential, commercial, employment, growth, and associated services. So that's how that was our first go at defining it.
Yeah, and I guess for me, because it's our first urban containment boundary, I guess I'm struggling with why we give it the full 20-year vision boundary versus matching it with policy that's focused on infill first. So if the OCP is getting reviewed every 5 years, why wouldn't we build it so that it reflects the next 5 years, knowing that when it gets reviewed, it can change. So if other municipalities are working that way, so our land use designations can stay because we can put wording in there saying future neighborhoods are designated. They currently sit outside the urban containment boundary. This policy, and all the policies that would go around making those work.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. It's really, these tools can be used in different ways, and so the way it was initially thought is we'd use the urban containment boundary to be the far outside, and then we'd use this new future residential neighborhood designation to kind of tighten up in scope on a temporal scale. But, there are certainly other ways to do it. If we have direction to do it another way, we'll do that.
Yeah. Can I just follow up? I guess the reason I say that is because some of the confusion that happens in the community is when people don't understand why we're making OCP changes. So if we put an urban containment boundary that's out so far and contemplates many, many years of growth, I think it's more challenging to see where and when we would make OCP changes. Because people operate more in a short term. So while our policies could be Squamish 2040 and moving us in that direction, the urban containment boundary to me is something that seems more like a shorter term tool.
One consideration, and I think that influenced us, was in terms of using and proposing the urban containment boundary as an ultimate backstop, like an ultimate line, and also within the urban containment boundary, as Matt has mentioned, for the first time we tried to differentiate between existing residential and neighborhood areas for infill versus this longer-term temporal designation of these future residential neighborhoods. And with associated other tools and policies like the population threshold and the separate phase sub-area planning and what have you. So we were trying to find a good balance, I guess, between highlighting and providing certainty to the community, like here's the ultimate delineation of where we would like to extend servicing, and then include other policies and use the designation, the land use designations in tandem to try and further highlight how infill will be prioritized, and then how phased expansion will occur over time based on demonstrated need.
Sorry, Ken and Doug.
Thanks. But we were talking about the geology of the land and not knowing without doing some planning how you might phase some of the land in, right? And so that's why I think that the big line gives you more of a variable. So you might say, okay, we're going to allow 20 acres to come in the next 5 years. Where's that line? That would be determined. I mean, is that why you're going with this route?
It does allow future detailed planning to identify what's appropriate and what's not.
Yeah. That, I mean, that's why I see that as being okay.
Yeah, I think we can use these tools in different ways, and if there's a preference from council, we can implement it.
Doug?
Yeah, and I'm okay with that. I take the points of my colleagues, but I think at this stage, it would be difficult to start carving up these sections into either increments or developable, non-developable. I mean, you might be following contour lines, for example. We're not going to go out there and start surveying at this point, of course. So that makes sense to me. But I think what we want to do is have some pretty clear policy language around how we think that might proceed incrementally. And the two that come to mind are one is there a maximum elevation that we would consider, notwithstanding the fact that the whole square is yellow. There are parts that might be above a certain elevation, and therefore and secondly, probably unless there's exceptional circumstances, we would develop contiguous to existing development, and which is sort of common sense, but if you start putting those things in, then I think it lets people know that it's intended to be a whole series of small steps, not one giant leap to the far borders of a district line or something like that.
Certainly for a long time, we've had a policy within the OCP that saw the 200-meter elevation as kind of the maximum elevation, or the elevation at which we would want to sort of focus development and servicing below that point. It's interesting, through the engagement, some of the public questioned that policy and that 200 meters and saying, you know, that's just above 200 meters, it's just another water pressure zone, basically. But I certainly think that that you know, as you extend up and up, you know, there are servicing implications for consideration. By the same token, through this OCP and through integration of the Integrated Flood Hazard Management Plan, you know, it's a new day, and we're also considering restricted and conditional densification areas within the floodplain. So these lands in higher elevations also, don't have that same hazard. So it's very much about
Issues with every
on
stitch
the
of
low,
land in
on
the
the
ditch.
high, yeah.
So I don't think we put the urban container to bed, but I think we've had some good questions and conversation about it. Do you want to move on?
Sure. Yeah. And then, so sub-area planning, another tool that's well established in the current OCP. These are comprehensive, detailed, long-range area development plans and are intended to focus on the how of growth management. A sub-area plan considers a huge range of items such as phasing and sequencing, transportation, servicing. In the draft OCP, we are proposing adding some additional elements to be addressed and to be considered in a sub-area plan, and those are density targets, in part to support servicing and ensure that there's a density that supports servicing. fiscal impact assessment, and provision of employment lands or employment generating uses. So these are items that would have to be considered in developing a sub-area plan. And staff also, so sub-area planning is established in the OCP. There are areas that are identified as needing sub-area plans before development. Staff has largely picked those up, but we have extended in 2 areas, the areas that are that we're saying need to be planned for with sub-area planning. One is extending this area down here. This parcel wasn't fully covered by the requirement for sub-area planning, so we extended that to include that area. And then this parcel right here, which is adjacent to and just north of Crumpet Woods, was not identified for sub-area planning, and so that has been included as an area that is suggested for needing sub-area planning, or is required for needing sub-area planning.
So just to be clear, all the orangey, yellowy pieces now all sort of have the same litmus test on them all?
Yeah, so not only do all the future residential neighborhood areas now require sub-area planning, but previously the employment lands there that are kind of in the middle of that block also had previously been identified as need sub-area planning, and now that the remainder of the Crumpet lands we're saying need sub-area planning. Now there's a that does have zoning already, that area, and so they don't necessarily need to apply for sub-area planning to do rezoning. They can proceed and do subdivision and do development. But it is an area that would be great to have sub-area planning around as it develops, so we'll apply to there.
Further to that, the northern yellow parcel, I can't actually read the district lot, but those are the remainder of Thunderbird lands. So those have sort of base RS1 zoning, but there is sub-area planning required for those lands as well, for those upper lands. And there was a draft sub-area plan, I think, that council saw back in 2008, but it was never adopted. Anyway, before any new development will be considered for those lands, sub-area plans required.
Yeah, on sub-area plans, 2 points. One is looking at the report, there's quite, it seems like, I'm looking at top of page 9, the sub-area plan must include detailed land use plan, including total developable land, maximum dwelling units, commercial and industrial land uses, consideration of neighborhood node, phasing and sequencing, density targets, etc., etc. All of that would have to be prepared before rezoning or OCP change would be considered. So that would be presumably the developer that would have to bring that forward. And that struck me as being a fair amount of work before we would even think about accepting the zoning application. Is that a fair process? Because we might turn around and say, no, come back in 10 years after all of that. Or is there some way we can decide, yeah, we're going to consider rezoning, so now we'll have a sub-area plan, so that it's not completely futile. It's maybe the subject of a conversation going forward in the future.
If I may answer that, normally the developers would ask for rezoning and the sub-area plan at the same time, so the 2 processes would run parallel, so that you're not spending all this effort and it doesn't work out in the end. So just like the waterfront landing amendment went through, and I believe the original application as well, the sub-area plan and the rezoning moved at the same time.
So that's a little bit different than what the report says, because the report says the sub-area plan has to be completed before anything would be considered. So there is a provision, so they'll go along more or less hand in hand.
Yeah, so I think the council would not consider the application for rezoning until the sub-area plan is adopted, but I think what we're talking about here is engagement and work alongside. So there are different ways we can handle that. We could allow work to happen concurrently.
And I'm fine with that. I mean, that makes more sense, frankly. I think that we just have to be clear about that.
Okay.
And the other point on sub-area plans was in the existing areas, and now I'm thinking about something like the North Yards, and what might trigger that. And And this is not somebody coming to us with a district lot to rezone. This is a whole series of small fragmented parcels. And I think, without making any decisions today, on areas like that, I think we're going to have to be prepared to preemptively do it and just anticipate development pressure and get going on that and start budgeting accordingly. And the areas that bring to mind are the North Yards, Denville area, Brackendale, and there might be, I think it was the Estates was another one constructed. But there are areas like that where we're going to have to trigger them. It's not going to be development pressure particularly, or a single development pressure.
Yeah.
That will do that.
Absolutely, and that, just to clarify, this provision for requiring a completed sub-area plan before considering a development application is specific to these undeveloped lands, that is not necessarily specific to the existing neighborhoods.
Just to follow up on Doug's question, in order to trigger that rezoning and the sub-area plan process, we would have already met a population threshold or 85% of, so whatever rules we put in place, no one's doing any work until we know that that's where we're going in terms of expansion. The other question I had was also similar to Doug's about what we do for existing neighborhoods. And my question was, is it possible to do that work ourselves, but then charge like a latecomer's fee to the developers who then go on to develop in those neighborhoods? So as part of their CAC policy, they pay us back for doing the neighborhood plan for that area. And I don't even know if we can do that, but it's a way to try and recover costs, but get the planning done. So that was one question. And my other question was, can we make sub-area plans or neighborhood plans for existing neighborhoods a policy precursor?
I think those are very creative suggestions, and certainly one that we were thinking about in the lead up to this discussion was considering how we could almost piggyback more detailed neighborhood planning with any new development that is going on, recognizing that, you know, if a proponent brings forward a proposal within or adjacent to or on the margin of an existing neighborhood, that wouldn't it be nice if we could have some dovetailing and harmonized planning for the adjacent neighborhood that's accepting of the new growth, or, you know, and how are those transportation connections working? How do they contribute to the network of parks and open space? So is there a way that we can actually piggyback and tie in some of the neighborhood planning that we know we need as neighborhoods evolve with some of the new development proposals that are coming forward? So that would be a really great thing to explore through the plan and the policy.
I certainly read that in the report, and I was trying to think, you know, for North Yards, unless someone does a lot of lot consolidation, it'll probably be few lots that develop at a time, and how those smaller developments couldn't drive a whole neighborhood plan. So we still have to put money forward as a district to get that done. So I was just trying to figure out a way to reduce our costs, but make sure it happens in the short term, especially in a few key neighborhoods where we don't have a lot of space, but, and, you know, North Yards doesn't have enough park space and amenities, but we also don't have a lot of land to play with either. So the sooner we create a neighborhood plan, the better. But it'd be great to have future developers help us pay for that.
Yeah.
And so can I just follow, are you suggesting that within the OCP we have language that effect, or?
I don't know where it would go, whether it would go in our CAC policy, or whether we put language in the OCP to say that we prioritize some existing neighborhoods for neighborhood plans. But it
Maybe
is
it's something. Jason,
For sub-area plans, I mean, especially for existing neighborhoods and neighborhoods that were developed without a master plan in place, I mean, it's certainly, I'm comfortable with the districts getting started with that right away and, you know, resourcing that out of municipal funds, because that's something that traditionally gets done, and in larger municipalities, they do community planning exercises every so often as part of their OCP. So sort of to adapt that to whatever Squamish's needs are. And, you know, and from my observation, the North Yard is probably the best place to start, because it has seen significant growth relative to its size, and it is a lower amenity area. So, and also too, it's a small area, so I think it's something that you know, it's not a major multi-year project to get it done. I mean, we can do this in a reasonable time frame. So I think that you know, of course, always it's good to try and find other resources where you can, and you know, we expect greenfield development to do this, and that's just the new standard. But for infill, yeah, it's more complex to get that rolling. So and also too, sometimes you know, there may be conflicting values between what a proponent might want to do in a neighborhood and what the existing residents think, and that might get a bit messy, as opposed to, you know, when you have a sort of a blank slate of a greenfield, there are no existing constraints to deal with in terms of existing development.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I think we should plan for them, like Karen's saying, but I'm worried less about who pays for it. I think very fundamentally, community strategized plans, and it's sort of something for existing development we have to just initiate as on a priority basis, basically. Agree very hard. Then go where there's a few others are definitely. Doug?
Yeah, briefly, I mean, I'll take responsibility for steering us off topic a little bit, but there was a note here about what would trigger planning, existing sub-area planning in existing neighborhoods, and so I did make a note about that. But I'm not sure that it really is kind of an OCP discussion. I think my comment is more directed to planning staff to kind of think about bringing these things forward over the next 3 years, for example. We could do one a year on existing neighborhoods and just budget for it accordingly. And on cost recovery, the thing that occurred to me is a surcharge in the zoning fees for subsequent applications in these areas that already have the sub-area planning in place. That's a cost that those developers don't have to incur, that a developer of a greenfield site would have to incur. And so I'll just leave that comment with the planning staff as well.
We can. It could be a surcharge, area-specific charge for maybe development permit applications, because we're assuming that once the sub-area plan is adopted, then the development will be at DP stage.
And I think as long as it doesn't discourage development where we want to focus development, that's right. Yeah, let's continue.
Okay, and just my last piece here to talk about is really high-level review of the options that we've talked about so far, both in the council chambers and with the community. So option 1, which was the infill priority, generally reflects the status quo. It has a population threshold of 22,500 prior to development in all future residential neighborhood lands. That's been expanded from the 2 district lots areas to all future residential neighborhood lands. And this option provides strong support for short to medium term growth management, but it doesn't have strong long-term growth management characteristics, and so it may lead to slower infill absorption in the long run. Option 2 is to, I have some nice little boxes there. Option 2 increases the population threshold. Spent a lot of time on this box. Option 2 increases the population threshold to 34,000. That provides strong growth management through the long term. It clearly directs growth to our infill areas until our expected capacity is absorbed. But it has no policy support for developments that may come to us with significant benefits in future residential neighborhood lands. And so that's where option 3 has come in. This provides opportunity for limited development in future residential neighborhood lands given significant community benefits. It represents less robust growth management that could slow infill absorption and enable urban sprawl, depending on how many of these developments come forward that are considered to have these significant benefits. And then that could be associated with some higher servicing costs if there's that extension of growth. And then finally, option 4 was brought forward by staff at the last meeting as a balance of strong growth management and community input regarding District Lot 509, 510. Right, it enables some limited development on that district lot in exchange for a number of community benefits, including high priority mountain bike areas identified by SORCA. But I want to point out, and there's a letter attached to the agenda that SORCA has submitted, and that indicates that SORCA now feels it's too early in the process to specify lands for recreational dedication, and that they prefer to work with the landowner in the future during rezoning. And along with that, Mr. Chima, the landowner for District Lot 509-510, is here today and has indicated an interest in changes to option 4 that he would support. And he has also separately identified changes he'd like to be made to the Phase 3 engagement summary, and there are letters to these 2 items that are attached to the agenda. And so that's something that can be discussed perhaps later in the meeting after we've talked about the more general growth management pieces. And so in summary on these options, if council wishes to select the strongest growth management option and direct as much growth as possible to existing infill areas, then option 2, infill priority plus, would be an appropriate option. And if council wishes a more nuanced approach that addresses concerns identified by the community through feedback received during Phase 3, then consideration of elements from option 3 and 4 would be appropriate. And then I just wanted to talk, because this question had come up I think a couple times from council about significant benefits. Council had identified or questioned what criteria could be used to determine a significant community benefit. Staff has put forward this as one possibility, that a significant, or perhaps we could use the term extraordinary, benefit must provide a transformative improvement to the community encompassing multiple values across the social, economic, or environmental spectrum, or resolve a major community challenge for which no other viable solution exists. Just a thought for consideration. And that is the conclusion of our presentation, and we wanted to leave it open now for more discussion and hopefully some resolution on direction.
Jason.
Okay, well, just to, I think I made it fairly clear in the last meeting, but just to reiterate, you know, I appreciate the work that staff is doing to do the engagement and, you know, develop choices for council, so I think that's really good. I'm still leaning more towards the option 2. And the reason I'm leaning towards option 2 is that I think that within our existing framework, even if we go with that option, there are mechanisms in place to deal with, you know, unexpected or changes in situations where we may want to change that policy. And I recognize as well that, you know, 5 years from now, we're going to be reviewing this, so there will be another opportunity to do that. So I just think it's very incumbent upon us as a council to be very clear about what we see as being the best priority right now. And for me, I think it's option 2. I think the option 3 and 4 is going to put us in a situation when we're going to have multiple requests to reopen things, and because you know, every applicant, they want to make the community happy, they want to have community benefits. So I suspect that we would have a flood of applicants coming in and telling us about the very significant benefits that they're going to provide, and to me it kind of sort of it risks making our infill less of a priority. And I just think about all of the land on the ocean front and waterfront landing and a bunch of other places that have already been rezoned and have the capacity to absorb that. And just one little note that I forgot to mention in the earlier discussion, I'm hoping that maybe perhaps one thing that seems to come up quite frequently in these conversations is, well, what are we going to do to ensure that there's an adequate supply of single-family land, single-family lots. And I'm just wondering if, you know, as we go through this process, we'll have sort of a number that tells us what we have under the existing. Because I think a lot of people feel that, oh, the only way that we get more single-family lots is greenfield development. And I suspect, from what I recall, that we do still have a significant number of single-family residential on the books or very close to. So,
And we may be addressing some of that with the missing middle conversation next weekend. Yeah, go ahead.
Just on that topic, we don't right in front of us have those numbers, but we certainly can get them. I have done like a loose analysis, and it's hard to, there was the change in uptake of single-family lots was quite low for quite a while. In the last year, I think, of building permits, it has climbed quite substantially. So it depends on, the years of supply depend on what you expect to continue. If that what happened in the last year continues, it actually, that's a fairly larger demand than the traditional demand. So, but certainly we can put that information together.
If I could add, certainly the supply that's coming online has been predominantly, well, outside of the downtown, has been predominantly single unit dwelling in terms of the build out of formally approved single family subdivisions. I was just looking at the census data from 2016, so in terms of the housing stock that we have now, it's very much skewed towards like 47 or 48% of our housing stock is detached right now, whereas, you know, and 17% is in the form of like sort of townhouse or low-rise apartment. So we're now looking at what is the mix that we have now, what is the mix, and this is also important for our work with the school district, for this OCP, because they're very interested in our growth areas in terms of what's coming down the pipe, because their student population projections are all based on, you know, the number of units that are coming online in 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom. So we're starting to sort of piece together a much clearer understanding of the form and mix of projected housing as well, but it's certainly single family.
I'm kind of excited the census is being used for that.
Thank you. So, one of my complaints about the status quo is the lack of fairness, and this is the issue that came up in the last council actually, with the cap on 1 or 2 lots and not on other lots. So for that reason, I'm not that keen about option 4, because I think it goes the other way and treats one set of properties differently from other sets of properties. I'm kind of sort of at option 2, but I think I'm leaning towards option 3, and I just find option 2 is just a little too rigid, and option 3 gives us some flexibility that I think we need, and it's a statement. And even if we adopted option 2, I mean, we can, as a council or the next council or whatever, I know can come along and just amend something, but I think as a policy statement, I prefer the statement in option 3, and with language, and I think the draft was a good start. We want to make it clear that we don't want to just have somebody show up and give us a shopping list of things that they're going to add, and trails and stuff like that, and expect to get zoning. I think it would have to be, in my mind at least, it would have to be quite extraordinary benefits. So I'm more favoring option 3 for all of the, in effect, the future residential neighborhoods. In the statement, significant infill, 85%. I think that's a good number somewhere around there. It's a significant number before the process even starts, before the sub-area planning process would even bother to put staff resources to it. Stay away, we're only at 75%. Don't talk to us. I think we want to be pretty clear about that, unless there is something that is a real community benefit. It's just a matter, I think, of getting that into a narrative.
Thank you. Apologies. Karen was supposed to be pushed up. Karen entered.
So one of the things we didn't talk about, I don't think, but influences how I feel about these options is the policy precursors. And you mentioned a few. One of the ones that I'm wondering where it fits is our interface fire policy, because we're talking about future neighborhoods, and this summer would provide some evidence that we need some policy as we expand up into that area. So that one for me, completed sub-area or neighborhood plans for existing neighborhoods. There's a few others that you mentioned. So I certainly am leaning towards option 2. I prefer option 3 over option 4 because, and I said this last time, I don't want OCP to single out specific landowners anymore. I think policy should apply across the board. I could go with option 3 if we included the idea that we had to have significant build out of our existing neighborhoods, like the oceanfront and more, because I don't want half-baked neighborhoods all over the district. That seems ridiculous to me. It doesn't help our transit, it doesn't help us create the vibrancy that we're looking for, because we just create this sort of scattershot approach. But option 3 would be more palatable if it had all those policy precursors attached to it, in my mind. And I think, you know, my experience on council is that anytime we've really struggled with a decision, it's because the policy's been lacking that we needed to help guide our decision. And before we start opening up these lands, I would want future councils to be really sure that they've got the policy framework on which to base those decisions, because these would be major changes. And so I guess I'm sitting between 2 and 3. If 3 got stronger, I might move in that direction.
Thank you, Ted.
Thanks. Yeah, Jason mentioned something on number 2 there, being the ability to also bring in, and I don't know if I heard you right, but change, for example, lands that are not in the existing plan for development and bring them in, if you went with 2, or is that what you said?
Sorry.
Didn't you hear that?
No, I'm not sure I understand. Can you clarify?
Well, he said that even if we went with number 2 and some lands that were not in number 2, with the policies that we have in place now, there should be a way of bringing other lands in. And so I just wanted to understand that.
And just to clarify that, I mean, essentially, I mean, this document, like any policy that council produces, is subject to change. I mean, obviously, if you want it to have integrity, it's not something that you want to change every 6 months. But, you know, my point was more like if some really big opportunity that, or big, you know, potential problem that needs to be solved came about that we don't know about right now. Because in my mind, right now, I don't see that. I don't see anything that necessitates the special consideration as option 3 suggests. I'm saying that future councils or, you know, would have the ability to review that and make the changes. It's more about setting principles in place so that when you know, a landowner or a developer comes to town and they take a look at the landscape, we're sending a fairly clear, consistent message about, okay, well, you know, if you're looking to do development in the next 5 years, probably you're going to be looking at these areas. If you're looking at 20-year horizon, well, here's the other options. And that's sort of my point, is that nothing is ever set in stone. I mean, it's not a development freeze, it's not a, you know, it's nothing like that. It's more about being a little bit more prescriptive about where we focus growth. And I just think that at this point in our history and the what capacity we have, that I think we're in a position to really to consider that.
And just as an example of that is when Trust University came almost 20 years ago now, that was obviously a very significant thing that impacted our OCP and the regional growth strategy that hadn't been developed yet. But that type of scenario would qualify under significant, for example, our council could at least evaluate it on. What's that?
I just wanted clarity of that before I.
Okay, sure, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, because I didn't, you know. So, you know, in saying that, then, you know, I'm leaning to 3. Community benefits, I see community benefits on some of the lands that we're talking about. And, you know, we talked about Quest University 20 years ago, some of the lands we're talking about were in residential and they got taken out. So on fairness, I like number 3 because it does give an opportunity for when community wants to work together, whether it's trails or whether it's road loops for buses, and services. You know, like up in the Highlands where we may need some servicing loops, and it's clear and open for staff to move forward on something like that. I wouldn't want to tie it to density elsewhere, like tie it to the oceanfront saying, well, until the oceanfront's completed, we don't want to go up into this area. I mean, I wouldn't want to do that either because it's a different type of land use. And when you do that, you sometimes benefit other developments. So I'm thinking number 3 there is pretty good.
So, I generally agree on somewhere between option 2 and option 3, and I think what council's looking for is a little more detail around what significant community benefit may or may not mean, so we understand what we're agreeing to or not agreeing to. I agree that we should be more, call it fair, just more non-prescriptive about certain landowners or not. So I guess that's my issue with option 4 is I think it should be, if we're gonna clean that slate, let's clean it. And I guess I'm trying to understand what option 3 means in terms of, it's quite a bit of a jump from 22,500 to 34,000, and that's a 20-year jump. And, is that me? Is that inside my head or outside? And trying to understand if there is thresholds within thresholds that we can figure out that make some sense that help manage it a bit better too. I don't know if there is, but, and this is, I guess, my problem with the urban containment boundary, which is following the outside of certain big lands, is that maybe there's areas within that maybe there is a population threshold of 22,500 or 20,000 or whatever that might be, and then there's another population threshold, because 20 years is just a long time to project out, so just trying to get my brain around that piece.
Is there room for some kind of stepped piece where it's option 2 until we reach 22,500 and then option 3 kicks in with the 34,000?
That could be one scenario we contemplate. I don't want to be prescriptive about that yet because I don't really know what the impact of that is yet, but something like that. Or it could be, and then we still could have that significant community benefit, those real extenuating timing issues or opportunity issues that we want to be able to at least have the option to consider. But yeah, I mean, that's how I feel about it. Anyone else want to chime in on that? Yeah, I'll come up there and
I think for me, I want to create certainty in, certainly in the short term, for this council, for future councils, for the community, about where they'll see growth, sort of in the next 5 years, certainly, and probably longer than that. We have a lot of capacity, and I'm concerned about moving to 3 too quickly. Because we know how expensive it is to make transit work, even with our existing neighborhoods, and what we've contemplated in terms of Waterfront Landing, and that's like a 20-year build-out, Oceanfront's a 20-year build-out. And then if we start thinking about expanding our infrastructure and transit to meet even more neighborhoods, we can't even satisfy customer expectations right now in a lot of neighborhoods because they're not dense enough. And so I get a bit nervous when we talk about, can we pull it in? We have a lot of capacity, and I know eventually we're going to need to move up out of the floodplain. There's no doubt about it. That's going to start to make sense if we don't get a handle on climate change. But I don't feel the urge. I do want to leave the door open if there's a significant community benefit that we don't understand, but I actually would like to create quite a bit of clarity that there's not really the need for that housing. And I guess, I hear the argument that if we build more, everything becomes cheaper, but I'm not seeing that play out anywhere in the world yet. So So I'm not convinced that that is a real argument. Maybe staff can tell me something different, but,
Sorry.
you know, we're in a unique position, and people all up the corridor are feeling the pressure of housing affordability. And, you know, what is expensive for us might appear cheap to someone from Vancouver. And so I'm not sure that we're going to see affordability change just because we release more land. I think that's a trap.
I think other policies are gonna help with the affordability and more than just supply plan.
What about significant amenities? How does that fit into, just as compared to what she just said there? What if a parcel has significant amenities in the community? Do we just ignore that?
No, I don't think that's what she said at all.
I don't
No,
think
no,
that's
I'm
what I
asking,
said.
no, you didn't say that, I'm just asking you that
I
question.
said, I think we need a lot of, I think we need to be quite certain about the thresholds and where we would contemplate. But like Jason said, I think, you know, the council of the day understood Quest University to bring a major community benefit. And I think any council of the day would look at those opportunities and consider them. But we've got to set a high bar for what that is. And right now, there's no guiding policy for what that is. You know, you can see that even in the developments we contemplate today. Someone sets a very high standard for their development, someone sets a lower standard, but they both get approved. And when we're talking about future neighborhood development, I think that bar has to be clearly defined and guide this council and future council in their decision making. So that's what I'm hoping where this policy takes us.
Anything more to add, staff? at this time?
No, at this point, we're just really hoping that this discussion could culminate in direction on, you know, which of the options or a combination of the options are best, and then hopefully some more direction on the handling of the urban containment boundary.
I'll go to Doug, and maybe I'll just have you catalyze what you think you've heard, general concepts, and then we'll make sure that anyone who's here has option to speak to as well.
Thank you. So looking between 2 and 3, which I think is where the conversation is focused, 2 has a threshold of 34,000. Presumably, once we got to that threshold, however it might have happened, then we would accept applications for these lands and start considering going into these lands. 3 doesn't have a threshold of 34,000 or any number. Presumably, it would have the significant infill, the 85% or whatever that test is. And I see problems with both of them, and some of them are highlighted in the report. If we got to 34,000 and we didn't have the infill, all of a sudden we put more land on the table, and that will threaten the infill even further. So there's that issue with just a hard threshold and nothing else. And if we don't have a threshold and it's just pure significant infill, what happens if one of the developments takes off and does well, and then there's another big development that for some reason, market or internal financing or whatever, just hasn't really got off the ground, but it's sitting there zone, and it's not part of the 85% obviously, so everything stops until they catch up. So I think we have to be careful about that. And in my mind, it's going to be a bit of a blend of both, and I haven't got a sort of a statement to make right now, but I think when we're talking about this threshold, we have to contemplate possibility if we're going to have numbers of population in there, what happens if we're way low on our infill. So it's a combination of you have to hit this plus some percentage, and what happens if we don't have that infill through other reasons. Something comes up and we've got land sitting there like we have for the last 5 or 10 years, land sitting in a zone that just hasn't been picked up and taken to market yet. So I'm kind of stuck with those 2 things because both of them, I think all the options sort of contemplate some kind of threshold before you get going, and if you haven't reached the threshold, then there's possibly an option 3, the significant benefit test. Option 2 doesn't have that test at all. I think we have to kind of also think about that threshold or how we define those thresholds.
Cool. Well, okay, I guess in an attempt at a summary, I'm hearing that option 2 and 3 are the ones that have the most support at council. It sounds to me like option 3 has more support the better defined it is to ensure that the significant benefit is truly extraordinary, and also to minimize the chance that it just becomes an opportunity for development to continue with, you know, some benefit, but really bleed into urban sprawl. And there's concern around how we make sure that we achieve infill, that we don't set a population threshold that doesn't reflect what we're all trying to achieve, or that we don't set a percentage that stagnates us because of 1 or 2 lame duck developments in the community. So I think I'm hearing some of the values that are trying to be achieved and some of the objectives. And I think what I'm hearing is we need to go back and figure out how to encompass those in an option that blends option 2 and 3. Does that sound like a
I think that's fair. I mean, I think you just need to understand what option 3 intended and unintended outcomes of option 3, and whether or not how we can word that to meet the objectives that we're trying to outline in the OCP. And it may change as people don't want to speak to it.
In addition to advancing perhaps a blended option 2 and 3, what I heard from Councillor Elliott also was trying to create greater certainty for the short term in terms of creating clear policy direction for infill priority, say that's the next 5 years. Is that something that you'd like to see sort of built into the policy edits in some way, like a stepped situation where we kind of carve off, okay, what are we aiming for, what kind of urgency and priority do we want to put in infill
I'm looking for that.
in the next 5 years, and then beyond setting up some of this criteria essentially.
Yeah, and I think that's where my earlier question about the urban containment boundary and how we use it and what its time frame is versus our policy. If they perhaps could be used as 2 different tools, one focused more on the short term, the other focusing more on the long term. And that's why I wondered about bringing it in, and I think maybe that's where Patty's comments were about, like, why does it go all the way around? Can it be more subtle? But I just think for me to move to supporting 3, it has to be a pretty high bar. I heard in the engagement feedback from the community that they want, they know Squamish is growing, but they want to preserve that small town feel. And the way to do that is to keep improving our neighborhood connectivity and not enabling urban sprawl to me. It's about getting our neighborhoods right, the ones that we have, and also giving a chance for these new neighborhoods to come into their own. I mean, even in a 5-year timeline, it's hard to imagine what will even exist at Waterfront Landing and the oceanfront. So even a 5-year timeline seems really small in terms of contemplating opening up future residential neighborhoods. So that's why the presence of policy precursors is really important to me as well. And yeah, just wondering if we can use the urban containment boundary notion differently than it's currently proposed.
Yeah, so I just, as far as the comment around, the risk of lame duck development, I mean, I push back on that a little bit in the sense that, I mean, if we look at what we have on the table, I mean, it's not just oceanfront. I mean, oceanfront certainly is a significant part, but still, I feel like it's actually quite balanced. I mean, we have, give or take 1,000 units there, we get 1,000 units Waterfront Landing, and then we have, what's the other one up on the Line Channel?
Scott Crescent.
Yeah, Scott Crescent. And what's interesting about those developments is all three of them are actually hitting different parts of the market, and they're actually different housing types too. So I think that there's quite a bit of diversity. Plus, you can't forget that there is so many opportunities for, you know, sort of those micro rezonings where, you know, you're taking a couple of lots that are large on Government Road or elsewhere and, you know, putting 10 units on the market. And I think we'll still see those continue, just the way that our land structure is and the land tenure is. There's still quite a few opportunities, and you know, we have Sky Ridge, you know, we have some single family homes coming online in Brockendale. So I think we actually, for the size of our municipality, we have a pretty good mix. So I'm a little bit less concerned about that, and I like population as a marker because number one, it doesn't discourage employment uses. Employment uses are somewhat independent, and it's, you know, population is still sort of the best measure for what general cost of local government is, and so I like that. I think that's it's not perfect, but you know, it's easy to understand and very clear, and I hope that we can stick closer to that measure.
Lisa, and then Jeff and the rest.
Something that's come up in the discussion has been focused around policy precursors, so a set of criteria in place so that we have the necessary policy to direct and guide decisions around future development. Councillor Elliott brought up something interesting related to transit, and that was more about performance. So how well are current neighborhoods and existing areas being serviced by transportation or other kind of key needs or amenities. So that's an interesting point to bring up because that's another layer that we might want to try and consider as to at what point do we want to bring on or consider expanding into new areas before we've met a certain set, like performance measures for existing neighborhoods to make sure that those are being supported and livable and that they're connected and all those things. So we haven't explored that at all, and so that might be something interesting, and we're curious to hear more from council if you see that might be something that you'd like to bring into the mix as well.
Jeff, come on, join us at the table.
Okay, thanks. So, yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak. There's about three things rolling in my mind as we go through this. One, like Karen, you talked about the small town feel. I think a bigger part of that sentiment from the feedback is having a proximity to forested lands, you know, more natural lands, so not necessarily a small urban town feel, but a place, you know, I think what characterizes Squamish is our proximity to nature and everyone's joy of recreating in nature. So I think that's really important. There are so much green forested lands that people of Squamish take for granted as always going to be there, that we play in, that are owned by Mr. Chima, Bob Fass, you know, the whole Chikai development and the dump trails and all that area. So I also don't think that everyone totally recognizes that these things, you know, are not public land. We can have access shut down from them, or they can be turned into, you know, whether it's commercial or log or resource or residential. So we need to, well, and also looking in the OCB plan, there's a real lack of green space permanently allocated within those containment boundaries. So I think if you looked at that and you took out all you said this is future residential, well, if that's going to be future residential, what's future 100% guaranteed green space? So that's kind of a problem for me, because I think most of the land in that zone, you know, and I think the biggest part of the green space that's not in like an estuary is the golf course, which is great if you're paying your $50 green fees to use it every day. So you know, it's not accessible as much as we'd like to see. I think we need to have green, permanently designated green areas. I think that's a great opportunity through this OCP to lock that in now, to create in, you know, what's really our Stanley Parks of Squamish, and try and lock those in. The other thing that's really important, and you know, I know Jason, you were talking about, I don't see the problem. For me, we have a mountain bike industry and outdoor trail running industry that's growing. In 2016, it was $10 million in economic benefit directly from visitors coming to Squamish to mountain bike here. Probably in 2017, that's up to 12 million, and next year it'll be 14 million. It's growing like crazy, and the trail running and everyone coming from the outdoors to use our land is increasing. When you get to a tangible, you know, practical level, Mr. Chima's land obviously is smack dab in the middle of what we and many mountain bikers view as prime real estate, and has some of our best trails there. It also is right in the middle of connecting one network and the other network, so, you know, kind of like having that not exist would be like cutting the cables on the peak-to-peak gondola. Like you would be separating two really important networks if you didn't have access guaranteed through that zone. So far we've been really fortunate with Mr. Chima, but also Bob Fast and every other landowner. We've been good to be able to negotiate at least, okay, you can use it, and yes, you can run your events through it, and you know, most of the running races have also had good success applying with them and getting success. So guaranteeing a green space, and this is where we get to what could be the significant benefit, because we've been also talking with Polygon about what they're willing to do in order to transform their green space into residential, and their, you know, what significant benefit they're willing to provide. I think it should apply to every developer, is if you're taking green space or putting in a development that has previously been a public recreation zone, whether it's officially designated or not, there has to be some kind of significant trade-off. To have a zone, you know, say Mr. Chima's land, for example, to have a zone there that is guaranteed as this will be public land and will house a mountain bike reserve or trail running reserve, or you know, at least a green space that's saved, I think gets to the stage where this starts to be significant. And then the negotiation becomes what percentage of the total land is exactly there. So that's where, you know, allowing our mountain bike tourism industry to grow at its rapid rate, because, you know, like even our Sorka membership has grown 50%. We were 800 members last year, we're 1,200 this year. The amount of traffic on the trails is growing 20-30%. So we know that whole industry is growing. There's a lot of new rental companies in town that are growing. We don't want to do anything that will hurt that economic engine, right? I think that's a really important factor. So kind of finding a way to get access to land that's really important for mountain biking. The trade-off is not, you know, like it's a trade-off. You're giving some land that you'd probably rather not develop, but this is what you get in return. So I think that's worthwhile. If you look at kind of why this whole plan and containment is important, it's really to help costs and manage costs. So if we can find a way in engineering this new additional development to be of, you know, neutral or minimal cost increase in the long term, I think that's where the problem of we don't want sprawl because it's going to cost us too much in infrastructure starts to be mitigated. And then I think you can kind of, and I think it comes down to getting really smart and creative in how that whole development gets engineered in such a way that there isn't such a burden for the future for the taxpayers of Squamish. That's kind of where my head's at.
Well, I think you said it. I mean, I think we're trying to figure out what significant community benefit is, what it means to different people. Is there a test? Is there a threshold? We have to figure that out, and that's part of the conversation. Absolutely. We're not saying yes or no to any lands through this process. We're trying to figure out what significant community benefit means. Ted?
Well, just after hearing that, maybe staff, when they're looking into, you know, coming back next next time, you know, I know that there's trails all over 509 and 510. You know, and I didn't want to really point that too directly at those because sometimes that doesn't help. People take offense at, you know, looking at something special. But I would be interested to know the two pods that these two lands connect, or the true trail systems that these two lands connect. I mean, I didn't really know that. I'm not a mountain biker myself. I also know that in my travels in the last couple of years, I've probably met 7 or 8 people that make a living through mountain biking in one way or another. And I have tenants that are in my building that make a living with mountain biking. And so maybe it would be beneficial if we had some kind of idea of the connection that 509 and 510 do make to our community. And I've heard staff talk about a sewer line loop and things like that, and a water loop for fire, you know. So I'd be interested to know.
So, we're getting a little off topic.
Well, just you know, to Jeff's point though, I mean, a significant benefit. I don't want to mess up on some significant benefit because we haven't the information to determine that. So if you say, you know, it's a $50 million business, mountain biking in Squamish, and 45% of it relies on these trails, then you've got a number in our head and we can determine maybe how, maybe number 4 is illegal. You know, I mean, I don't want to see problems, and I like the designated green space. I really like that for the future. I mean, maybe we can get working on that. Just,
I've got a whole list, so we're gonna, Karen, Doug, Mr. Chino wants to speak.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments, Jeff, and, you know, I like the idea of, you know, understanding what Squamish's Stanley Parks are. And I think that, for me, is the argument why we put policy in place before we open up some of these big lands, because I think it would be irresponsible of council to make that up as we go. And I think, you know, not in this OCP, but through community engagement with all of our trail users and the community, we figure out what that looks like. And I know that's one of the policy precursors that staff have put forward is understanding our high value trails and where they are and how they connect. And that's the kind of policy I want to see in place before we expand boundaries, go into future neighborhoods. Because I think without really taking the time to engage on that and build out a plan and designate where we believe we protect our brand and protect our recreational industries, I think we'll make mistakes. And I don't want to see that. That's why I'm reluctant to move to options 3 and 4. I don't like 4 because it's saying about one landowner, but trying to find that balance between protecting valuable recreation industry and also having policy in place to make sure we do it well. But thank you for your
Doug, and then Bob, if you want to join.
Thank you. It was just on this policy precursor subject, and it relates to trails and going through the report. Policy which stipulates that trails lost through development be replaced with additional length of trails of the same or better quality. And I read that and I thought, holy smokes, that's an incentive for landowners to close their property because these trails are being built practically as we speak. And so somebody coming along 5 years from now could find themselves a lot more trails that they have to compensate for than they might have today. So I think we might want to get away from that hard language and think about things like connectivity, certain recreation values. I mean, I guess the question is, what are the trails? Because as we all know, as you walk through these forests, they're braids of trails. They're all over the place. And the kids down my block will have a whole set that they manufacture just off their back fence kind of thing. So I think I would get away from that kind of a hard ratio, if you like, and talk about ensure connectivity, ensure recreation values. I think the reality is that if anybody went into any of these parcels and started to do a reasonable development, you're not going to get all the trails. You're not going to save all the trails. I mean, there's just too many of them in some places. So some of them inevitably are going to be lost, and we have to things like that. But I don't want to give an incentive to a landowner to close the trails, close the property off.
So, I mean, on that topic, I didn't read it that way, I actually read it like, actually, it is clear guidance for any new developments, this is the expectation. So I think maybe it's just in the wording or something, because I didn't see it as, certainly if there was no growth in perpetuity allowed on a property, I can see a landowner getting fussy and wanting to close trails, but I think what this is trying to do is, should the door be open to development, these are our expectations. So I didn't read it the same way as Councillor Race read it.
Just to comment on that, we do have a similar policy in place now in our official community plan that you have to maintain the trail connections. And it has been a very useful piece of policy, even when it's not a rezoning one, when we're dealing with subdivisions. So I think there's definitely value in maintaining it. Maybe there's language could be made a bit more softer, but it's not like we don't have a policy that talks to that already.
I was looking at the wording in the report, replaced with additional length of trails of the same or better quality, so that to me was a hard ratio, so I was just trying to get away from that.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, that was a reflection of input from Circa, I believe, or was it the Trail Network? There was,
Both us and the SDS.
yeah, the Circa and SDS put together a set of trail recommendations to strengthen protection of the trail network, and so we had brought that in, but I hear what you're saying, and we've got to find a way to make sure that it isn't an incentive to stop any development of the trail.
Can I just clarify, just because and our approach is that they don't need to be on the same piece of land. Like if someone's going to develop a spot of land and there's really not room for a workable, decent trail, because the character of the trail will definitely change if you're putting a development up there, then there just has to be funding to create a similar trail somewhere else, right? So, and that's where the importance of locking off land for just recreation, where in the future this is planned and no one's going to come, 5 years down the road and either log or wipe out your trail network that you just spent a pile of volunteer, lifetimes creating. Right?
Appreciate it. Well, come on, join us. If anyone else wants to add their 2 cents, please let me know.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I think we had a long day, so I'm going to be very brief and short. And you heard about the community with 595 times we can bring the benefit there is, and you hear from them. Saying to myself, this is going to be this your land, you're saying it. So my question is this: like I hear from the council, there's so much land left over already in the OCP and Saudi zone. Like why we are dealing with the green space and right beside my land. It's moving forward for the last 6 months and coming back in October again to the explicit of the council here. That's a green space. I'm talking about, driving range. If you have so much land, why other application moving? Not even in the OCP. This is like a green space in the city. So that's one thing I want to put on the record, and that's it.
Nothing's been approved there, just so everyone's clear.
Yeah, prior to this going on and moving back and forth, start with council sitting, it's going back and 4 or 5 times back to the council, it's taking if it's not going to consider, it's taking stops time and council time is going on for back and forth.
Yeah. No, and I
it's
think
not even the part of this OCP, and this is a green space. It's not showing anywhere in the map if that land is going to come out. That land should have 34,000, or that should be land developing after our land. You get considering that right now. That's not even talk in the OCP that piece of land. That's going on. Everybody knows that while it is part of this OCP, that land people should talk about what's going to happen, how they're going to get developed too. That's not rezoned that piece sitting there. That's not even a single person bringing that on the map and talk about the land, how they're going to be impacting the community, how that's going to be serviced, how much this is going to take sewer capacity and everything. It's like we talk about 300-400 units there.
And I think
nobody even talk about this in the open
the
house.
policies that we're trying to do is to make sure we're dealing with those. Currently, they're allowed to make the application under OCP. Through option 2, and through tightening our OCP, we're trying to get away from undue work in areas that we don't want to develop. And I don't know if that piece will apply, because I haven't put my mind to that, but that's, I think, what we're trying to do with some of these policies, so that we're not doing
works in areas that we should be doing it.
Yeah, but nobody been talking about that piece in this OCP, there's like,
I think the polygon piece.
Like, well, yeah, so, just from the perspective of planners, right, in the OCP, the polygon piece is, it has development in many areas around it. There's development to the north, development to the south, it's close to the highway. It's a more natural next development phase than some of the higher, further far pieces.
I don't want to get bogged down in specifics, but I think we're trying to create a really robust OCP that we are focusing in on where our biggest bang for our buck is and strategizing for the future. Cool. Anybody else want to chime in at this point? So what's the next step in that?
I do still, I would love to get a little more clarification on council's feeling about the role of the urban containment boundary. I know we have talked about that, but it's a bit hanging there in terms of what direction. I feel like it is still going to be challenging, to be honest, to sort out how to address option 2, option 3, but we will put our minds to it and bring something back. But the UCB, I still would love a little more direction.
I'll chime in and then I'll go to Ted. For me, I think if I had a better understanding of the urban containment boundary, it might help me better understand the limited peripheral expansion. For me, it feels like, so I'm not overly happy about where it is. With the northern section, and for me, it's really about containing residential sprawl as opposed to any employment lands or job opportunities. So for me, that's where the delineation is. So, for example, if we're to look at these two, I wouldn't, the urban containment boundary, if we're trying to hold in residential pieces, we could totally take the purple part out, but for me, doesn't preclude if in the future council wants to consider servicing the airport, for example. I noticed that the landfill isn't in the urban containment boundary, and there may be gas capture there in the future. So I don't want this to in any way minimize those opportunities. So for me, it's really about residential containment. Part of that is infrastructure. Infrastructure just is the types of roads, it's transit, it's dog catching, it's police, it's fire, it's all those things. And so that's definitely part of it, but for me, it's really about urban sprawl in terms of residential subdivision. So that's why I think this boundary doesn't make sense to me.
Could we call it a residential containment boundary or something, more considerate, a residential containment boundary?
And maybe we have a residential containment boundary and an urban containment boundary, and then we can clarify what those two things mean. I don't know if that's getting too complicated or not.
Does that speak to council generally?
Yeah, I'll go through you know what, I'll just go through, it was Ted and then Doug and then everybody else.
yeah, thanks. The one thing that I'd like cleared up is significant community amenity,
Amenity or benefit?
both.
In reference to
In reference to,
the option 3?
yeah, because I think, I'm just afraid we're missing that. I think it's just me that's missing it, but I mean, listening to Jeff talking about mountain biking is, it's one of our biggest businesses in this town. It's one of the biggest businesses in this town.
We have a world champion.
That's right, we might even get a parade.
Yeah, I hope so. Everyone knows.
Anyway, but I do think that's, one of the main things that's been brought forward that I need more clarity on.
Doug?
Thanks. So I like the concept. And these suggestions, I was just looking at the two maps. The one that has the southern set of suggestions I agree with. In the north, I agree with excluding the, maybe we can put the slide up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that little yellow piece in the center there, which is part of the present proposal, should not be outside of the urban containment boundary. I think that would just kind of undo the process that's already started, and we'll just make a decision about that one way or the other. For the time being, purple I think should. I think for a couple of reasons. sends a message that we don't contemplate development there. As I said earlier, I'm focused primarily, but maybe not exclusively, on residential containment. There might be some commercial uses that we would also want to continue. I don't know, dealt with banks and lawyers' offices and stuff like that. There's all kinds of things. We tried to focus in certain areas, and so there might be some things like that. But generally speaking, I think of it as residential containment. And I agree with staff's take on it, the way it is. And the part that wasn't on the maps that we looked at, I understand the limitations of trying to carve up some of the district laws at this point. And so I would not look for that, except for some, perhaps some policy around it.
I like the changes that you've suggested for the northern and southern. I agree with Doug on the Chitai portion. I'd rather not stir that for instance until that decision has been made. Yeah, I think, personally, I think it should reflect a reluctance to expand into future neighborhoods. So I would pull it in on the eastern boundary myself. And I think there should be language accompanying it that council would consider servicing employment lands outside of their urban containment boundary.
Yeah, on the northern one, I think that we do want to maybe have some specific language on the airport, just because of the history of the airport and everything that's gone on with that, to be very, very clear that we're going to exclude, the following uses will be considered. And I think we should be actually quite specific, because I don't think that, for example, we would contemplate retail along the highway in that area. So I think we should make it pretty clear, because if the Chikai goes in, the servicing is actually going to go up pretty high there, and there might be interest in that. And I don't think that that's what we're suggesting is retail. I think it's more if we can maybe just have a schedule, like a list of limited industrial, airport uses, landfill related uses, and a few other things. And I like Councillor Elliott's idea about we will consider expansion for servicing if it's for an employment related use. So we'll take it from there. And the other question, and this is more of a question to council, is how do we feel about uses in this area regarding what I sort of call like the nature tourism stuff, right? Like recognizing that there's some camping and cabins and those kind of things. Do we consider that a limited use? And I don't know what our definitions specify, if that is, do we want to contemplate that in this area or not? So, to discuss later, I suppose.
Is that helpful in terms of?
Yep.
And I would echo I'd like to consider alternatives for the eastern boundary on some of it, as opposed to just going around specific lots.
Well, the employment lands and tourism lands. So that pertains to mountain biking.
Sorry, can you just clarify employment for exclusion or for uses that we can do north?
Karen brought up the idea of helping employment lands.
Okay, yeah.
We're open to considering
Yeah, and
servicing
Jason brought
too.
up the idea of helping tourism lands. But it's mountain biking. So I just,
We'd be there, it was specific to infrastructure.
yeah.
What if, yeah. Okay. Great, so you're gonna go back and fuss, digest, rewatch this tape.
So easy, just there's one answer.
Um,
No problem.
And then this will come back in a final draft, or how is this going to come back to us?
I think that what we're contemplating is bringing it back as a whole with the final draft of the complete.
If you get to a point where you think we need to hash it over, if you've got to get to a, then we'll bring it back.
Okay, sounds good.
And I think, yeah, really putting some understanding and language around significant.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Could we look at that proposed definition and
Oh, yeah.
hear some thoughts? Okay, so this is what staff had proposed as the definition for a significant benefit, or in some ways because of the level of importance that we've put on it, perhaps extraordinary benefit would be a better term, but the thought is, I'll let you read it.
And is it just about providing transformative improvement, or is it about, I guess I'm looking for council's direction on, is it about preserving extraordinary assets that exist? Like, where do we draw that line?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because part of the feedback that I received at the events is that some businesses are located here because of our brand, because of our recreational assets. So I think, you know, part of that statement needs to talk about why we're special. And Jeff, you know, summarized it pretty well. And, you know, I've had company owners say, if you sacrifice our brand, we won't stay here because it doesn't make sense. And so to me, it's got to say Squamish. It's got to protect what our citizens have told us is really important to them.
Yeah, so it's not just transformative improvement, it's
Preserving what we do best.
I think in my mind, resolving a major community challenge for the noted viable solution, we can certainly include what you're saying, but I think in drafting, I was thinking, well, we've got some of these incredible assets that are not secure. And so that could be a major community challenge, but we can be more specific.
Personally, I think we should specifically
Yeah.
mention what it is we're trying to
those
preserve.
community values that.
Yeah. We're world-class rock climbing, mountain biking, trail running,
Beer
wind
drinking.
sports, binge drinking.
We're number one. No.
Yeah, that should hopefully change by the next health report.
I don't know.
I don't know, but anyway, I think we should be
Yeah.
specific about our brand. It matters a lot.
Doug?
Yeah, and I was just going to widen it a little bit by also significant opportunity, which is slightly different. And I think about Quest, go back to Quest, which is out of the blue came this opportunity. I'm not sure it would actually quite fit into that, but it might. But you know, so that we do have the flexibility to take advantage of opportunities. And whether it's for something existing that we can grab, or whether it's something we don't even know about yet, I'm not distinguishing between the two.
And I don't know if this is something that would go in the OCP or not, but some either evaluation or process or public decision-making that's not overly bureaucratic, that sort of says, yes, we think this could meet the litmus test for significant benefit, therefore somehow that comes to a decision, and at that point, you can say, yes, it's significant or not, and then then you still have to go through the OCP process and stuff, but at least something that makes it not so cumbersome to actually do.
Some reference to public input or public engagement on it?
I mean, that's certainly always part of it, that's sort of understood, but I think some process whereby we actually give it a, yes, we'll consider it as a significant community benefit, or no, it doesn't hit the mark. Something, and I don't know if it should be in the OCP or not, or some other policy, but if we just put this thing in the OCP that's a significant benefit, every other week we may have someone come, oh, I've got something I think is significant benefit, and then, so we want to make sure it's clear where, and we, you know, all of a sudden a ton of staff work goes into something, and we should sort of determine that significant benefit up front. And I don't have my brain totally around what I think we said, but I think we need some clear, simple process to determine if we consider it or not, and we move forward at least with, it could be a process whereby we have someone that says they have something significant, council goes, it's significant enough that we want to understand if it's significant. I don't know, like, but I don't want it to become some cumbersome thing or something that just all of a sudden we have application that, as Jason said earlier, just sort of opens the door to unrelenting demands on our staff. Karen had.
The other thing too, in terms of tightening up the language, when we say encompassing multiple values across, and I don't think it's just about encompassing those values, because what I think might be a social good might be really different than what Jason thinks are exciting things. And so to me, it's about raising the bar on, or providing more than what you would normally expect, I think. You know, whether that's a higher LEED standard for buildings, but don't bring us the everyday.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a whole other piece to it, like greenfield development, there's a whole other bar that has to be that, but that's almost outside the OCP, and maybe there's reference to it. Maybe that's in rezoning and master planning and sub-area planning language. But yeah, I think anything that's building new infrastructure is needing a different bar than infill. And where that language gets put in, which post-production is.
It seems that too, it would be good to tie it back to the major goals and objectives in the plan, that as a bare minimum, you know, we're aiming for, you know, meeting all of these 5 core goals and then this suite of objectives. And certainly any given proposal may or may not sort of check all those boxes, but we might expect that at a bare minimum, a proposal that was deemed to be a significant or extraordinary benefit would tick off most of and beyond those, and advance us beyond those sort of minimum.
That may be a way of meeting them.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Oh,
I'm just happy that we got onto this, and I really do think it's important that this stays in no matter what number we pick. This stays in as an open door. And understanding,
so you're option 3, not option 2, is what you're saying?
well, I want
Option two
something, yeah, because of this, and there's information out there that I don't know about some of these lands, or all sorts of lands, there might be an opportunity that comes in this, and we don't want to close the door on that because we've been too strict and say, well, we can't open that door for 5 years. Jason brought that point up, saying even with option 2, that we should have room to open this, right, Jason? Did you mean that when you said that? Well, you said there was an opportunity, council could change.
Not specifically. I mean, I think, you know, you can send a signal by you know, putting things like that in there. And so I'm saying, no, we don't do that. But that, regardless of what we do with our OCP, there's always opportunity to change. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone, thank you very much. Motion to close, moved by Karen, seconded by Jason, all those in favor, motion carries, and we'll let Kelsey take the room first.